speechcraft and the audience.
100,000 years ago, the first words were spoken on this planet. Today, words are an important part of almost everything we do, right down to our most personal thoughts. Words allow us to communicate, and therefore to collaborate, and do those things that make us most human. Words have the power to communicate ideas, and ideas hold great power, so it is no surprise that some people, such as Martin Luther King, became great masters of this medium, while other people, not so much. We should have a slide of George Bush. We'll go from there. George Bush is easy to make fun of. His Bushisms have generated plenty of comedy, but it's a little unfair to suggest that he wasn't a good speaker. He did, after all, win 2 elections. Maybe the first one was a little fudged, but the second one he won. I think the important part is we weren't the audience he was speaking to. He was speaking to an audience that wanted a president that they could have a beer with. Think about it. If he had done what Martin Luther King had done and decided to preach about the dream he had for weapons of mass destruction, it hardly would have worked. So there's no such thing as a good speech. There is a speech that is well targeted to its audience. Now, saying that Martin Luther King and George Bush had different audiences, that's hardly profound. But what about if we looked at a situation where the audiences, the situations, are much closer together? That would allow us to pull out the nuances of targeting an audience with a speech. In the summer of 1940, Winston Churchill stood before the British Parliament, and later the radio microphones of the nation, on the eve of the evacuation of most of the Allied forces from the continent of Europe. He delivered one of the most defining speeches of all time. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. A little over a year later, Roosevelt, similarly on the eve of a great attack, the day after the attacks on Pearl Harbor, stood before the houses of government in his nation and the radio microphones of his nation and delivered another of what would become one of the most defining speeches of all time. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Both of these speakers, Roosevelt and Churchill, were some of the best rhetoricians of all time. They were speaking under similar situations, and so it's no surprise that there's lots of similarities. Most importantly, both leaders predict that they will go on to victory. They will face hardships along the way, yes, but that they will achieve victory. That's not the important part. The important part is that the British and the Americans are slightly different as audiences, and so the speeches have important differences within them. Agency is one of the most important factors in the telling of any story. Agency is simple. Am I speaking to you? That is, you are the audience. Or are you, that is, I am the agent, you are the audience. Or are you listening to me? That is, you are the agent, and I am not. It's not that one is more true or one is better, but they have different impacts in the telling of a story. Churchill chose his agent. We shall fight on the beaches. We. That most inclusive of all pronouns. We is the British people. It is the English-speaking world. It is everyone who is against the Nazis. But most importantly, the agent is the British, the we. Now Churchill goes one step further. He avoids distracting from the agent. We shall fight on the beaches. What, Churchill? We're going to go as the British down to the beaches and have a national brawl? No. We shall fight them on the beaches. We shall fight the Nazis on the beaches. But Churchill leaves this out. He does not want to distract from the agents, the British. So why? Well, first of all, there's the blame issue. There were a lot of people in England at the time who wanted to surrender, who wanted a negotiated peace, who said, we cannot stand up to the Nazis, we must surrender, we are being forced to do it. Churchill says no. You can choose to surrender, but if you choose to, it will be your choice, and your choice alone. No one is making you do it. We are the British, we are agents, and no one tells us what to do. Don't blame it on someone else, it's your choice. And he's also playing on a very important British sentiment. In 1939, King George addressed the nation to tell them that they were at war. And in his speech he said, we can only do the right as we see the right. It's not about what someone else made us do. It's not even about what is objectively right. It's about what we, the agents, the British, see as right. He goes on to say that the British have a duty to protect civilized order in the world. The British are special. They are the center of their story. The world revolves around them. That is the perspective the British are told. The Americans, not so much, at least according to Roosevelt. Suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Japan. Japanese. Some variant of that word appears in all but 4 of the sentences in the first half of his speech. It appears in fully half of all of the sentences in his speech, and it appears twice as often as any reference to America, the United States, or Americans. The Japanese are the agents of Roosevelt's speech. He goes so far with this that he does not even acknowledge the efforts of Americans. The heroic soldiers that successfully fought off the second wave of attack at Pearl Harbor, no mention, no credit. He is dead set on ensuring that the Japanese are the agents of this story. So why? Well, again, there is the blame game. Now, in the lead-ups to the attack on Pearl Harbor, Americans were not exactly in favor of a war. In fact, the America First Committee was one of the largest anti-war movements that country has ever seen. In 1941, it had over 800,000 dues-paying members and countless more that were involved without paying dues to the organization. They said to Roosevelt, keep America out of conflicts. America first. Work at home, don't get involved. Well, it's not exactly what Roosevelt did. Roosevelt, among a great many other things, was instrumental in implementing the embargo against Japan that probably caused the attacks on Pearl Harbor. So if the agency slipped from the Japanese back to the Americans, perhaps the attack was actually Roosevelt's fault. He had to avoid that. But more interestingly, he's also playing on a very American tradition, the Declaration of Independence. A great proportion of this document is dedicated to declaring the causes which impelled them to separate from the British. They didn't separate because they wanted to, because it was right, because of anything other than the British made them. They were impelled to. And so he tells the Americans what they would expect to hear. He tells them why the Japanese have impelled them to go to war. They're not going to war with Japan because it's right or just, as the British are. They're going to war with Japan because Japan made them. Agency is a very important part of the crafting of any story, but it is only one part. Spin is another important part. Spin is that most maligned of rhetorical techniques. It is akin to lying in many people's minds, but I would argue it's much more subtle. It's the question, is the glass half full or half empty? That's spin. It's not a matter of what is true or untrue, it's simply a matter of the perspective you choose in telling the story. So, for us to understand the spin that these leaders choose, we have to understand a little bit about the statistics of what actually happened. We've all heard the stories of the ships that were lost at Pearl Harbor, but for every ship that was lost at Pearl Harbor, fully 11 were put out of action at the Battle of Dunkirk. For every American soldier put out of action at Pearl Harbor, fully 370 were put out of action at Dunkirk. Pearl Harbor was not as big a deal as Dunkirk. But from the stories that the leaders chose to tell, that's not the impression you get. According to Churchill, Dunkirk was a victory, a resounding victory. Yeah, they got kicked out of the continent, lost one of the most major battles of the war, but he doesn't really mention that. He mentions that they evacuated 4/5 of the British Expeditionary Force. They escaped when the British tried to catch them, and it's a victory. Now, I don't want to overstate this. Churchill does acknowledge that they are headed for hard times, but he is very careful to spin the events as a victory instead of a defeat. I think it's relatively easy to understand why he might have chosen to do it that way. Churchill was, after all, asking the British to go up against one of the most fearsome fighting machines the world had ever seen. If they were going to go to war with the Nazis in a meaningful way, they needed to believe that there was actually a chance that they could win. And yes, he could tell them they would win, but those words might have seemed just a little hollow. And so instead, he tells them they're already winning. They've already won a victory. So if they've already won a victory, surely they can go on to win more, and it makes his words believable. It makes the idea of going to war with the Nazis a more palatable option. But if that's the case, then why in the world does Roosevelt spin it the exact opposite? Remember that the attacks on Pearl Harbor, well, yes, devastating, were incredibly small in the overall scale of the war. And the attacks were largely a bungled disaster from the perspective of the Japanese. They failed to hit the fuel storage facilities. They failed to hit the most important ships in the fleet. They didn't damage most of the land-based facilities. They sunk a couple ships, at least one of which was already being used for target practice by the American Navy. So, not actually that big of a deal. But Roosevelt makes sure to spin it as a huge cataclysmic disaster. I think there's two reasons for this. First of all, there is a sort of threshold that has to be passed to justify going to war. Remember back to the Declaration of Independence. You have to be wronged a lot before you're impelled to do something. After all, the American interests had been being attacked for quite some time with shipping, etc. That hadn't justified going to war. So Roosevelt needed something big. But the second, Roosevelt was trying to draw on a sense of anger and rage. Anger towards the Japanese. Now, it's a little hard to get all that angry at a bumbling organization, a bumbling country that couldn't quite pull off their attack. So instead of pointing out that it didn't work quite right, he spins it as a disaster, a success for the Japanese. Now, I think we're all used to listening to political speeches. We all assume that we are being spun, that we are being manipulated, that it is crafted to get a certain result. But that's the case not only in official speeches, but in everything we say and everything we listen to, including our thoughts. Remember, they are words. So over the next couple days, as you listen to a lot of speeches and presentations, think about why the speaker has chosen the phrasing they have chosen. On Saturday morning, when David says something to the effect of, "We at Quest do such and such," why did he choose "we"? It was a careful choice, I'm betting. Think about why he did it. Thank you.
Time for a couple of questions.
I'm curious about the content of your Keystone paper. Besides, I'm assuming there's more than just one analysis. What else?
A lot. So I looked extensively sort of at the techniques of the two speeches on their own. So a lot of other details of phrasing, differences in terms of what they included and where they put emotion or left emotion off, those sorts of things. And then I looked at some other comparisons. One of the major ones that is in the Keystone that doesn't stand out here is the length of the speeches. While Churchill's speech is almost half an hour, Roosevelt's is less than 7 minutes if you cut out the time for applause. What's the differences there? And then other similar differences.
Another question? Yes.
You talked specifically about each leader talking
So I didn't look so much at who was involved in it. Both of these leaders are famous for largely writing their own stuff. Yes, with communication with others, but being very dominant in their writing process. I was more interested in how they matched the audience than in terms of who chose to match them in a certain way. You can look, especially for Roosevelt's speech, at some earlier drafts which have his writing all over it and crossing stuff out, which provides some insight in terms of his thought process from the first draft to the last draft, and what he thought was important and how he shaped it in that regard.
One more. John?
How long was the writing process for these speeches?
Not terribly long. Remember that Roosevelt spoke about 30 hours after the attack, so 30 hours tops. Churchill, this is part of actually a series of speeches that he gave through that summer, so a lot of the ideas were recycled, but it is given as a speech about the evacuation from Dunkirk in large part, and he gave this speech while the last ships were still leaving the beachhead. So not a lot of writing time. I wouldn't speculate in terms of how long he actually did, but less than a couple days.
Okay, thank you very much.